Hello, my name is Mark Lockneat, and today I'm going to be talking about real science in H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Color Out of Space, for my class at Signum University called The Literary Copernicus, the Cosmic Fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. Or, Radiation Monsters from Space! So, kind of an overview of this story. The Color Out of Space was written by H.P. Lovecraft in about 1927, in March of 1927 actually, and it details what happens after a meteor falls to Earth from the sky on the farmland of a poor unwitting family, and what kind of happens after that. So Lovecraft has taken a couple of approaches to his fiction. One is to create kind of these background mythologies, such as monsters from outer space that have come to Earth millions of years ago and have always been here and are being remembered by cultists and so on. But towards the end of his writing, he also tended to write things that were based more on real science and things that wouldn't be contradicted by the current time. And these are the stories that I think kind of work the best. And so what I thought I would do is take a look at The Color Out of Space and then compare that to what science was actually known when this was written in March of 1927. And from this, I think that we'll find that not only was Mr. Lovecraft a very good scientist in as much as he kept up to date with the things that he needed to know science-wise, but that he actually had a pretty good plan that this was a radiation monster. And this is something that he intentionally kind of built into the story. Everything leans towards this radiation monster being the point of the story. So let's take a look at how this might work. So first of all, let's talk about the premise of the story. The story is set on a farm near Arkham, which is, of course, kind of the stand-in for Salem, where the witch trials are. And we're told that up until this point at Arkham, nothing really strange had happened since the witch trials. So this is kind of like the first indication of things going weird, if we're to take Lovecraft's word on it. And therefore, it may in fact be kind of setting not only what we need to know for this particular story, but for all of the stories that come later with Arkham and all of the strange things that happen. So it could well be that this meteor is kind of the genesis of weird, or at least the regenesis of weird, after the Salem witch trials, or the Arkham witch trials, whichever you prefer. So we know that this is set on a farm near Arkham, and we have the point of view of a narrator who's coming many years after the fact, getting ready to flood the valley to create a groundwater reservoir, or to create a reservoir that can be used for drinking water for the city. And we get the story as he kind of goes through and talks to the locals, in particular a gentleman named Ami, and we get the story of how this meteor came to Earth and what it immediately did. So what we know is that a meteor fell from the sky to a farm, and that a glass-like nodule is found within this meteor, and one of the scientists shatters it, and shortly thereafter the meteor gradually fades away, and then bad things happen, very bad things. So I'm going to be focusing on the beginning of the story rather than the end of the story. I also would point out that this has been done before by many other people, and in particular, I would point you towards the Lovecraftian Science blog, which I have linked here at lovecraftianscience.wordpress.com. And there's already coverage of The Color Out of Space. And in particular, there's a really good treatment of the character of the meteor. Was it a radiation, a radiation source, or was it something else? A good discussion of the harmful effects of radiation and on optics and so on. So being that those subjects have already been covered, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. What I'm going to do is take a somewhat different approach. Science! Specifically, Science Magazine. So what I'm going to do is look at Science Magazine specifically for the few months before and during the time that Lovecraft was writing his story, The Color Out of Space. So about Science Magazine. So this was first started, and first published, I should say, in about 1880. And it covered a wide variety of scientific topics. It originally was founded by John Michaels in New York, and got financial support from Thomas Edison and even Alexander Graham Bell. So there was some folks there who were pretty big players that were contributing to this. The journal had fits and starts. It died and was resurrected a couple of times and passed between various people, but it eventually became the academic journal for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And it's been around for quite a long time. The reason that this is good for us is that this website, the Science Magazine, has not only a table of contents for all of their issues going back in time, but also scans of a lot of articles. So what I did was perform a review of the articles basically in February and March of 1927 to see if I could find anything in those publications that kind of matched up to what Lovecraft was thinking and writing about. And I also looked at other sources, things that were obviously known before March 1927, things that were common scientific knowledge, and then try to figure out exactly where the state of science was in March of 1927, and then compared them to some of the concepts found in The Color Out of Space. So, first of all, let's talk about the meteor. So, Lovecraft has always used, or often used, the idea of intelligences from outer space coming to Earth. Sometimes they're coming through in ethereal waves or from other dimensions or something like that, but in this case, they're coming directly from a meteor. And meteors and comets, the difference being that meteors tend to be rocky and comets are more icy, they were obviously well known before the 20th century. I mean, comets have been seen forever, and people have wondered what they are, and there have been massive crash downs and so on where very big explosions happened, and it may well be that meteors were responsible for some of the mass extinctions that we had on the planet. But not only do they have the potential for mass extinction, but it could be that possibly meteors had something to do with bringing life as well. But to get back to Lovecraft here, so looking at Science Magazine, was there anything interesting happening in the skies in early 1927? Funny you should ask. Well, the Pons-Winnecke comet was covered in March 11, 1927 in that issue. And they talk about how the comet is coming by, and it's going to be a very close pass to the planet Earth. So not exactly a meteor, it's a comet, so it's similar, but it's not exactly the same as what he wrote about. But it is something that's going to be happening right about the time that one might expect this story to be published. So it's interesting that in the very issue in March 1927, when he was writing this story, we have coverage of a meteor, or I should say a comet, that's passing very close to Earth. So it doesn't take a lot of extra effort to extrapolate, well, hey, this is awfully close to Earth, what if it actually hit, and work that into a story. Now, I also found it interesting that the comet is going to be found in June of 27 when it's actually going to pass by. It's going to be found in the constellation of Aquarius, which of course is associated in pop culture and in astrology with kind of the new millennium or higher thinking. And so one can easily think of this as being representative of some higher thought power or some higher form of life that is coming from Aquarius. And theoretically, maybe it will divert itself and hit the planet Earth or something like that. We just don't know. But it's interesting that this very comet was being written about and was going to pass about the time one might expect a story to be published. So comets have always been associated with big happenings. They have been interpreted as representing happy or unhappy gods. You know, if a comet's in the sky, maybe that is the vengeance of the god coming to get you, or maybe they're really happy. And in one particular instance, it was believed by some that Halley's Comet may have foretold the Norman conquest of 1066 of England. And we see this in the Bayeux Tapestry, which was created about the 1070s, probably by Anglo-Saxons. And it was probably commissioned by a relative of William the Conqueror. And you can see in this tapestry, which kind of shows the story of William the Conqueror, you can see this star up in the upper left-hand corner here, which is Halley's Comet. So there's a strong association between historical things happening, including invasions, specifically invasions, because what we see in The Color Out of Space is an invasion from space of some kind of extraterrestrial monster. And this idea of the conquest of England goes back to William the Conqueror and his family, which, coincidentally, also happens to be one of my relatives. My ancestral family tree starts with William the Conqueror and goes on from there. Coincidence? I wonder. Now, it's another interesting thing that there is this meteor. Once it hits the farm, the farmer Nahum goes and gets some help, and they begin to discover that the comet is shrinking. So first we hear about the comet, and I quote, "All Arkham had heard the great rock that fell out of the sky and bedded itself in the ground beside the well at the Nahum Gardner place." And we learned later that, quote, "It was nothing of this earth, but a piece of the great outside, and as such dowered with outside properties and obedient to outside laws." That's how we're introduced to the meteor itself. Now, when the scientists who are coming from the university get back with Nahum, they are wondering why the meteor doesn't look as big as they expected. And the scientist, quote, wondered why Nahum had called it so large the day before. It had shrunk, Nahum said, as he pointed out the big brownish mound above the ripped earth and charred grass near the archaic well sweep in his front yard. But the wise men answered that stones do not shrink. Well, actually, technically, some radioactive matter can in fact shrink, albeit very slowly, due to the fact that some types of radiation are actually shooting off little teeny bits of their mass. Now, admittedly, this isn't going to happen at the rate and the speed which we see in this story, but it is theoretically possible that, these things could shrink away. I think this is just a literary device in this particular case, but it is possible. Now, we also find out that it glows. So this is not too surprising. We know that the meteor puts off heat. We know that the meteor glows. And my thinking is that the heat could very well just be a matter of its trip through the atmosphere. Anything falling through the sky is going to, create a lot of heat and, an explosion and so on. But this glowing is not unlike radioactive material. So here again we have this reinforcement between the idea of radioactive material and the meteor. And there were radioactive materials available in Lovecraft's day. You could get watches with glowing dials that would glow in the dark from radium and so on. And there was this particularly nice, wonder-working, miracle-working paint called Undark. And this is the paint that poisoned the women who were licking the paintbrushes with radium on them. And they were the ones who had originally gotten cancer and kind of proved the evil effects on the human body. And also, coincidentally, created the very first lawsuit against an employer over workplace safety. So it was known that radiation was potentially bad, but we had these awesome products like Undark. The power of radium at your disposal. And here we have an actual advertisement for what Undark looked like. And this was some of the stuff that the poor ladies were ingesting on a regular basis. Now, we are also told that the meteor is soft and malleable. And from that, we get the quote that professors tried it with a geologist's hammer and found it was oddly soft. It was, in truth, so soft as to be almost plastic. And that sounds to me like some types of known radioactive ores, such as actinium or thorium, both of which were ductile, which means malleable, and known in Lovecraft's time. So from Wikipedia, we can see, actinium is a soft, silver-white, radioactive metallic element, ... kind of similar to lead. So it is very similar to substances that were known in Lovecraft's time, radioactive things that were malleable. And also, it's coincidentally being used now in radiation therapy. So the very thing that got all those folks sick, licking the radium-covered paintbrushes, is now being used for radiation treatment. So we also find that there's some other interesting stuff going on with this. Now, when it comes to the radioactive stuff, they're classified as non-primordial. So if you look at the specific thing, actinium, actinium is what they call a non-primordial substance, which means that it wasn't created at the time of Earth's forming and then persisting through that time. So the substance itself was not something that got created with Earth. It is something that actually comes about through radioactive material kind of degrading over time rather than something that was kind of born along with the planet. But that does mean that it's not something that was found naturally at the beginning of Earth, which could have been some kind of prompt for Lovecraft to say, all right, this is a non-earthy kind of substance. And it brings us a lot closer to the idea that this maybe was specifically actinium. Interestingly, the word actinium, the name originates from the ancient Greek word actis, which means a beam or a ray. And we know that Lovecraft loved to have his beams and rays. There's plenty of beams and rays in Lovecraft stories. So that's an interesting thing. Now, another thing is we find out that the meteor was, and I quote, magnetic, for one thing, and after its immersion in the acid solvents, there seemed to be faint traces of Widmanstätten figures found on meteoric iron. And so it may not be immediately obvious, but what these Widmanstätten figures is a kind of cross-hatching or a kind of pattern that's built into meteoric iron. And it has to do with the way that iron is formed while it's kind of cooling over time and its magnetic properties. But if you look at the pictures here, you can see pretty clearly that some of these samples look very much like they are manufactured. I mean, they almost look like, some kind of scaffolding or something like that. So the way that the meteor itself looks really gives the impression of it being manufactured, which implies some kind of intelligence. Now, another thing that we know about this meteor is that there was a strange glass-like nodule inside of it, which of course, being the Miskatonic professors that they are, rather than take it back to the lab, they're like, ooh, there's a big bubble, let's bust it. So that's what they do. They break the bubble and it kind of pops and then disappears. Gone. And they look for more of those kind of bubbles inside of the meteor, but find only one, which kind of brings to mind that whole idea that maybe this meteor is kind of like an egg. There's only one yolk in an egg, usually. Maybe that little glassy sphere that they cracked open was kind of the yolk of this meteoric egg. So this kind of brings together the idea that this is panspermia, or colonization from space. We know that the scientists, quote, uncovered what seemed to be the side of a large colored globule embedded in the substance. The color, which resembled some of the bands in the meteor's strange spectrum, was almost impossible to describe, and it was only by analogy that they called it color at all. So I'm not going to cover this whole idea of color because it's done well elsewhere, but a color that isn't a color that you can't see, that may well could be radiation or something to that effect. Maybe life has existed throughout the galaxy and has been kind of moving around through the galaxy in the form of life that's very, very hardy, that can survive way out in space, or can survive in stasis, or goes dormant, or something like that, and can hit our planet through meteors. And modern research is still trying to figure out if this would actually be possible, if the very right conditions could exist for organic life to survive a meteor impact. I mean, have it on a chunk big enough to hit the ground, but small enough to not create a huge explosion that would completely vaporize it. And they're getting kind of close. There have been people who have done studies that showed that the remnants of carbon, or kind of the signatures of carbonaceous life, could be found in little bubbles or little incrustations of carbon inside of glass that's formed by meteoric impacts. The idea here is that life could have come from space, not necessarily explaining where life came from originally, but that it could be getting distributed through the form of meteors and comets and who knows what else. They're kind of bouncing around through the galaxy, randomly hitting planets, and every once in a while we get lucky and some little piece of bacteria managed to survive and create a whole new planet full of life like the one that we now live in. But the idea of panspermia can be used another way too, which is that if it could come once, couldn't it come again? There's nothing to say that it only comes once in a civilization. It could well be that it's come many times, and when it came, it was hostile. So, another good scientific concept that has been worked into here. We have this kind of meteoric egg that crashes down, they pop open the egg, the thing disappears, and things proceed. Now the next thing we're told is that the meteor, the next day, starts to draw the lightning. So we're told that, quote, that night there was a thunderstorm. When the professors went out to Nahum's the next day, they met with bitter disappointment. The stone, magnetic as it had been, must have had some peculiar electrical property, for it had, quote, drawn the lightning, as Nahum said, with singular persistence. 6 times within an hour the farmer saw the lightning strike the furrow in the front yard, and when the storm was over, nothing remained but a ragged pit by the ancient well sweep, half choked with caved-in earth. And shortly thereafter, everything starts really, really growing. So after that lightning storm, and after the rain kicks in, we know that there was a whole lot of growth going on directly nearby it. So the story tells us, quote, then fell the time of fruit and harvest. The pears and apples slowly ripened, and Nahum vowed that his orchards were prospering as never before. The fruit was growing to phenomenal size and unwanted gloss, and in such abundance that extra barrels were ordered to handle the future crop. But with the ripening came sore disappointment, for all that gorgeous array of specious lusciousness, not one single jot was fit to eat. So, right after this happens, life. Abundant life, fecund life. So this is kind of interesting. Is it possible that this lightning had something to do with the growth, or possibly that the radiation had something to do with the growth? So let's take a look at that. Well, hey, actually, if we go back a couple years, we could find out that the effects of electricity were reportedly amazing. And there was folks like this French guy who were using electricity to grow things like clover 7 feet tall and gigantic trees and huge fruits and things like that. So this was certainly known at Lovecraft's time, and he very well would have seen articles just like this and may have read this very same article. So, okay, it's not in the 2 months before he wrote it, but it was pretty well known, or at least thought at the time, that electricity could have a very profound effect on growth. So maybe those 6 electrical strikes are kind of the kickoff that makes that thing start growing. And when it starts growing, everything starts growing around it as well. But what about the idea of radiation? Well, of course, radiation, sure, it must also be able to do stuff like that, right? So here we have on March 18th an article, again, the same month that he was writing this, about the influence of irradiation on the growth of seeds. And, this is a longer article. I'm just showing you the first part of it. But basically, they found that, yeah, they would, some things would actually make the seeds grow better. And of course, X-rays. Of course, why not X-rays? Another one. This is February 4th, the month before he was writing that. So we see that X-rays and crop seeds, if you X-ray your seeds, you could get something like 15 to 170% more yield. So this is the science that within the 2 months before the story was printed showed that things like radiation and electricity could do amazing things to plant growth. So is it any surprise then that Lovecraft kind of bakes both of these things into his story? 6 zaps of lightning to kind of get things started, and then the radiation to kind of make things grow bigger. Maybe it was a combination of both, I don't know. But either way, it's pretty obvious that this kind of information was out there, and it's not too much to think that Lovecraft had read these things and was aware of them. Now, another interesting thing that we're told is the idea of wind without air. So we're told that the, quote, trees budded prematurely around Nahum's, and at night they swayed ominously in the wind. Nahum's second son, Thaddeus, a lad of 15, swore that they swayed also when there was no wind. Okay, so how could we interpret that? Well, it's interesting that radiation was discovered a long time ago, well, relatively speaking, well before Lovecraft's time anyway. But in 1911, a gentleman named Victor Hess conducted an experiment where he proved that radiation came from space, as well as terrestrial sources like uranium. So he discovered that by going up in a balloon, he was able to determine that there was radiation at the same level up in the sky as there was down on the ground, which really surprised him because he thought that all of the sources of radiation were terrestrial. So he goes up in space and kind of finds these, these sort of cosmic rays, which are, of course, the solar radiation and the stuff that comes in at us from space all the time. So what I'm postulating here is that the tree was swaying to radiation from space, of course. So it wasn't just that it was of its own accord, but it was in tune with this radiation coming through the sky, coming from the sky, and waving according to that. Now, once all of this happens, things start getting weird, of course, and the radiation starts corrupting things, people start going crazy, and strange things abound. I'm not going to talk about what happens beyond this point, but there's a few interesting things worth discussing here. So we know that radiation starts to do bad things to the Nahum family, driving them insane, corrupting them in various ways. We hear about gigantic bunny rabbits, we hear about woodchucks, we hear about insects, specifically butterflies and skunk cabbage, and, well, pretty much everything, really. Things just go to hell once the radiation starts kicking in, and it's pretty bad. But let's take a look at a few of these things. So first of all, mega rabbits. I guess they actually do get that big. Who knew? That's a huge rabbit. I think like 4 feet long or something like that. But hey, rabbits do get that big. But I don't necessarily think that this was a new discovery or something speculative, because we've all known that there have been killer rabbits that have been documented since the times of King Arthur. Clearly, this was not a new discovery. Now, another thing is killer woodchucks. And we hear that the McGregor boys find a queer woodchuck that, quote, the proportions of its body seem slightly altered in a queer way, impossible to describe, while its face had taken on an expression which no one had ever saw in a woodchuck before. And I think that kind of matches that picture pretty well. So that's my internet search of a good picture of a queer woodchuck. But that's what I imagine the woodchuck probably looked like, and then why the boys kind of chucked that woodchuck away. And I like to think what would have happened if they had just given those woodchucks more of a chance to live instead of flooding that valley. Those poor woodchucks, they eventually got drowned. Who knows what they could have become? They could have become huge. And finally, butterflies. We hear in the story that, quote, it was a mistake of Nahum's to tell a stolid city man about the way the great overgrown mourning cloak butterflies behaved. And so if you look up these butterflies, these mourning cloak butterflies, they do in fact do very strange things. So one of the defense mechanisms they apparently have is that they will join together with other butterflies in a perch and fly menacingly toward their attackers. So you make these butterflies mad, they'll swarm on you. And another thing they do is that they fly away making a loud clicking noise. So this is not like any butterflies I've personally been acquainted with, but they'll swarm you, they'll jump you, and they'll make really weird clicking noises at you. Kind of like the butterflies in the movie The Dreamscape, written by Zack Whedon, who, yes, is Joss Whedon's brother. I don't know if I would want to be attacked by killer butterflies, but it really doesn't seem that threatening. You know, a can of lighter fluid and, you know, a lighter, some compressed butane, they're gone. You know, they don't hold up to the flames very well, but maybe there's something more to it. I haven't seen this movie yet. Now, another interesting thing, and this is completely coincidence as far as I can tell, is that the mourning cloak butterfly is technically known as Nymphalis antiopa, and one species of it is the Nymphalis antiopa hyperborea. And as we all know, Robert E. Howard was a friend of Lovecraft, and Robert E. Howard created the mythos and the story of Conan, who lived in the Hyperborean age. Is it a coincidence? I don't know. Maybe not. So, it could be that Howard kind of picked up on that. Seems awfully far-fetched, but Hyperborean age of Conan? Hyperborean attack killer butterflies? Who knows? Stranger things have happened. So, in summary, I wanted to make the point that Lovecraft really knew his science. There was a lot of interesting things that appeared in February and March, in the 2 months, the month he was writing his story and the month before, that seemed to have shown up, as well as other contemporary scientific things that showed up in his story. And I think that he really did a good job crafting a story that had a real true kernel of science to it. One that really didn't contradict the laws of science that were known at that time, and more importantly, didn't rely on invented mythology. As much as I love my invented mythologies, it really doesn't take the same kind of brains to invent a mythology and make it seem plausible as it does to find something that really includes a lot of current scientific theory and a lot of current scientific thinking like Lovecraft does, and come up with an idea that doesn't completely contradict it, and in fact seems to follow what was known of science at the time very, very well. So, that's one thing that we've learned, is that Lovecraft really knew his craft, and he did a good job with science stuff. We've also learned that old journal clippings and advertisements are pretty awesome, and if you ever get to Arkham, look out for the big pointy teeth, because that Vorpal rabbit might be there waiting for you. Thank you very much for your attention. My name is Mark Lockneat. Good night.